Okay, with recent events, we are all involved in some awesome conversations, which has been a little more difficult on me because we're doing it in a lot of different avenues and at different levels, which is very appreciated. It just takes me a lot more time to keep evolving it or adjusting to how many different variables we're all talking about in different specificities in sports. So this is going and still dealing with the bone remodeling or cortical remodeling, and we want to look at the differences in the training specificities or training ideas, and then up into the actual use of the specificity, and then towards sport application. And there seems to be some hangups in there that people want to go, which I don't want to ever hinder people going off and going down in those rabbit holes. The problem is that when we take it from the thought process of the strength application and transfer it to sport specificity, that sport specificity you will see adapts in any one of those slots. And that's where my mind stays up at that top brick view or the top of the mountain view. So if we're looking at the very top of the mountain of the actual transfer or use of the actual, and this will break down to bone cortical, the actual bone cortical transfer, or the ability to change our bone densities. In that change, I can then applicate it to any specificity that I choose or that any individual chooses. So if we look at a UFC fighter that may use it versus a Muay Thai fighter who those are the specificities, they actually are congruent in thought and transfer. They just have different names, meaning a guy hits a guy is a guy hitting a guy. Like, there really isn't much more to it than that when we really break it down, right? So I want to learn how to hit a guy harder. Doesn't matter to me if I put a boxing glove on it, a UFC glove on it, or it's bare knuckle. At the end of the day, that's a person learning to hit something else harder. So that's where I want to kind of touch on those areas, because there's so many people going, well, what about if I use it in Taekwondo, or why, if I only use it in karate? And you're looking at breaking it down so far that we're missing the bigger block. And I want to get us back up to that top view again, and then allow that to go down to those areas. So when we first look at that training itself, in all training, there's a general specificity of it, meaning we got to learn to strike, we got to learn to kick, we got to learn to punch. If this is what we're looking at for those particular things of the human body, what are we asking the human body to perform, and for what? So why are we doing it, and what is the intention, intent, or purpose? We need to understand those calculative variables to get the results that we want. So someone who's in a powerlifting specificity, that is their sport. If we're looking for someone who's using the deadlift to increase a lateral availability or a posterior chain, that now transfers to human adaption that then applicates to their sport, that does also have transfer to sport specificity of powerlifting or tactical or combative, or it doesn't matter to me. So each one of those does have an adaptive transfer. So we need to look at that. So in the fact of looking at the general, or as a lot of, if you go into the strength training world and you're not in a general populace, so if we're going from general, we go to GPP, or general physical preparedness, meaning the general attributed physical preparedness of an individual. Their breadth of availability, or the base of the pyramid is this. Can they kick so many times? Can they punch so many times? Can they run for X amount of time? Does it transfer to X? X being the specificity. What are we going to do with it? So now we're looking at a specificity that we can control on just how specific we get. And as we train, we start to look at that use of that exact spectrum is ours to control, per diem of our knowledge, per diem of our availability of experiences, and then obviously the wisdom that we have to applicate those experiences and wisdom at the proper times creates higher levels of variable for each one of these. So I'm going to come back to specificity, but I want to go then, of course, we move on to the actual sport or activity itself. Okay? So we have to look at technical strikes in karate versus technical strikes in Muay Thai. There are very close resemblances in them, but if we really break it down, we can look at the differences in types of strikes and how positioning of the arm and how they're, if they're down striking or if they're bringing it from a hip out type strike scenario. But at the end of the day, if we take it down far enough and look at the ulnar forearms and into the actual hand and hand bones and looking at the metacarpals, that kind of thing, this doesn't change relevantly. And we have to kind of look at the fact that we're going these big titles and big names of all that sport here, and we're going to go backwards to understand that the availability of what we want doesn't really change in the specificities. So maximal power is maximal power on a football field, an explosive jump in a football field, an explosive jump, say in a combative sport, an explosive jump for an actual combat person, meaning military personnel or first responder. Explosive is explosive, powerful is powerful. And then, those types of scenarios are very easy to understand once we look at that. As we narrow down even to a higher level of specificity or a very specific area, and we start to look at the bone cortical remodeling itself or bone densification, we are now into a very, very specific area. And that's what I want to kind of look at in those areas of going, a lot of guys have had excellent questions, and they're crisscrossing between them because they are all part of you and part of your programming. But we need to break it into specificities. So when we start to break down from the general applications, and again, all of our general purposes, our general movements, and even in this, we could kind of look at, okay, can he hit the bag for periods of time, into getting into the more specific explosive movements for fighter type or combative type, and then we break it down into the use of the historics of the specificities. And I want to go into that with the history also as we're starting to look at that. And the reason is I've given a lot of examples, and I want people to see it, because once they see the use of it and how frequently it is really going on around us all over the world that we just didn't notice it, historically it was a normalcy. It was not a different thing. It wasn't crazy. It wasn't outlandish. It was normal, because when we go back here in a second, I'm going to touch on history and how it's evolved, and we look at Western changes versus the Eastern times of history and throughout histories of its use, and it's in everything once you take time to look at it, clean back into the Egyptians' time, you start to understand why things have adapted and then what had happened. So historically, when we look at this, we start to look at what happened is as modern civilization evolved, our need of hand-to-hand combat de-evolved. So we lost, over historical times, in a short period of time, that availability of knowledge, because it's not something that we do day to day as part of our day. It's now a novelty versus an actual requirement. People back in AD didn't have a drone that had lasers off of it. They walked outside. If someone attacked their home, they had to fight them. They had to be prepared better than their opponent to survive. We look at that now and go, well, I don't need that. To prove that, or even to give a closer, more proximity for you younger people, it wasn't long ago, if you look at history, less than a few hundred years, there was no such thing as an automobile. Everybody rode horses. Well, now if somebody rides horse into town, and you see a guy roll across, with a quarter horse through McDonald's drive-through, you're kind of staring at him like an oddity. He's the strange thing. Like, what is that? Well, in reality, back in the day, everybody rolled in on a four-legger and didn't even know what an automobile was, and people who had cars were the oddity. And that's what has changed in population and our thinking processes due to marketing and sales and growth. But in that growth, we've lost our histories of what we as humans are capable of doing normally. So we need to look at that history to start. The second part of that is I've shown a bunch of different types of training. As you're seeing guys doing, if you've studied any major martial arts or gone into any martial arts studio, they have their own adaptive things in there. And one that's a real basic one is, say, like a push-up, a knuckle-style push-up. Well, when you think of how we do it now, is you go in and do your little set of 10, and it's your warm-up. Well, back in the day, they would do hundreds of them throughout the day. But then we also have to look at, like we talked about in the other videos, of what are they doing the knuckle push-up on, and why are they doing it? Now we're looking at it just as more of a conditioning factor on a 3-inch foam pad that we've put into these dojos, and that's what we're training off of, which is, again, is a soft impact. You're only doing 10 reps. If you look throughout history, and there again, I won't narrow down the thinking, but if you look out throughout history, these people do hundreds of push-ups that are knuckle style, finger style, different rotations, finger only push-ups, that kind of thing, to incorporate the strengthening and bone densification that actually has a reaction. Remember, all this has to be in a synocracy, or a constant manner, that it's all working together as it develops. Well, they were doing it, if you look at the old dojos, either it was outside, it was in a field, they were doing it on a rock. As dojos evolved a little bit, you start having extremely hardwood floors, that's what they trained on. They're using hardwood, type banisters to work off of. They're using cobblestones, or even now, if you look at the Shaolin Temple, they're still on cobblestone work, but they do use the padding now that they've evolved, because we do understand the need of that wave. But they walk on cement constantly, or are training on cement constantly, or working against hard objects constantly. And when you take a second and take a step back and just go, yeah, that actually is makes common sense, that if we actually normally adapt to any stressor that's on us, and we're always on hardwood and being thrown onto hardwood and punching into hardwood and training on cobblestone and push-ups on cobblestone, and then you'll see the advancement of push-ups as they start to do a push-up, and they'll actually come up and hold one arm, hit with the other arm, and vice versa, and come up and hit with the other arm. And these are all things, again, I've done throughout years of different trainings. But you start to understand okay, well, why am I doing it? It's not just a conditioning factor, or as the mind changes, it's not just a mind to muscle or a controlling factor for the actual technique, but it also incorporates the motor patterns that also adapt the bone structures and muscle structures and tendon structures. So you're looking at, we have done it throughout history, thousands and thousands of years, that we never took the time to actually sit down and go, why are they doing it? Or they've only specified it to such a 0.001 part of the population that the high level dojos or the high level people of the actual training styles knew it and would hand it down generationally, but it kind of dissipated to the 99+% of the world on why it's being done. Is it usable? Absolutely. Is it still there? Human adaptation hasn't changed in 200,000 years of studies that we know of, and it can go back farther than that for all we know. We don't have enough history to prove it anymore. But truth of the matter is, you can study it easily in the last 10,000 years without even a hesitation of all these different people, styles throughout the world, throughout history, that have adapted it, changed it, altered it. But again, if we go back into the general specificity of it, hitting a post to create stronger knuckles is hitting a post to stronger knuckles. Whether you're Roman, Greek, or Asian, does not matter to me. The human body, or their types of fighting styles, but the human body adaptation because of it is really where we're going to focus. That's where we stay. I don't need all that other noise in there, to be honest with you. That's where our focus is really at, is the human performance, human adaptation, and the why factor. All the rest, in my mind, is noise that's easily added in at any time. But if we stay very specific and very sharp, like a good sword sharpened right to the point, that's it. We're cutting right into the meat and potatoes, and we're getting the job done for exactly what we want it for. So when you take a second and take a step back and look at that specificity and what we're using it for and why, and then you start to see what they're training on, and you go, okay, well, if you watch even Muay Thai now, you're looking at trees. Pottery was used throughout years, where they're hitting hard pots, kicking into large pottery throughout centuries. All these different training methodologies, but at the same time, with the same center of the why they're doing it is for bone, cortical strengthening or remodeling. And that's where we want to come back to. So we have the general fitness of what we want to become as just a human, just being fit towards an ability to do something that's above normalcy. Specificity, we start to incorporate different techniques and choices that are more directly activated towards the need of what we want of it, towards the activity or sport or athletic choice or physical need, like a combative or a first responder, that needs to come back into this area. And then again, if we go into the actual where I want to start, as we go into these next things, the BCR, the bone cortical remodeling, is very specific for that perfect, or that, I hate to use the word perfect, for that actual narrowed in small percentage of those areas that we need. Now, when I say this before, and we've talked to a bunch of people, but the why you may need it is up to you. If it's a desire you want to go down that path, I'm just showing that it's out there. But then is, what do I need it for? So if you are a heavy striker in the hands and you are a very stand-up, just knuckle strike type fighter, then we're looking at, that's where the area of concern or the area of training should be focused. And then if we want to elevate that, which is of course is what I want everyone to think about, is how do you personally as an individual by yourself, everyone strikes a little differently, and going, okay, well, that's when I can adapt that philosophy to my particular individuality that gives me the ultimate level of return. And that's where we're teaching those same things of from generality to individuality gives the highest quality, because there's no better answer. So I can teach a general fighting class, but if you are a leg locker and this is a stand-up class and it's your weakest point, it will absolutely have benefit for you, but the downside is it's not your strongest point. If we're looking for these specificities of how do I hit someone harder, and I need to have the requirement to maintain my integrity versus their integrity, now we're looking at, I need to look at exactly what your strong points are and how to make them stronger in those directions. So I hope that narrows it down. I'm trying to do this very short and try to keep these even shorter, because I know that the information we're giving, people are feeding a lot off of and going a lot of directions, which is exactly what I want. So please bear with the fact that you're realizing going from bodybuilding to combative sport to bone cortical remodeling to tendon, there are congruencies between them, but they are very different. We start getting into a higher level of answer that has to be broken down very, very small, even to the molecular, as you're seeing here recently, on how the molecular organism itself adapts. But with that thought too, with the molecular organism, you have to remember that the bones themselves, even though they are a harder substance, are still broken down in a continuous regurgitated state of molecules. So they are not a solid, they are a living tissue. Just it happens to be that that tissue is a lot harder and less pliable or usable, because that's what it's designed for by a universal power that we have to study to understand this. So again, when we're narrowing it down into bone cortical remodeling, it is a very specific thing. As we look at that, I want people to understand that we can then adapt it to those areas of concern or want. And then how do we do that, as we've shown in the previous video, that it's just a part of the programming, it's not all of the programming, and how to applicate it. So I want to get this done real quick, because I know that these conversations are really taking off of those that are that area, and it's not a large group of people per se, but it is a lot of people who do talk to a lot of other people, and that's exactly why I want the thinking processes as they're looking down there, is to take time to see those videos of how you can see how many different art styles use it and how they use it differently, but the end result is always the same answer of why they're doing it. Kicking a tree and kicking a wood post, really, what's the difference? Kicking, punching into a super heavy punching bag that somebody's holding, and then turning around and hitting into a wood style product and hitting into steel or hitting into a concrete because you're able to. In time, you're looking at the same Y factors in there. It's just a higher level of ability that then is shown in time as it's become more and more able to withstand those kinds of trainings. So I hope that does it. Thank you.